Good afternoon, dear panelists. Our today's panel discussion is dedicated to the prospects of IPO in Russia. I do hope for an interesting discussion over the last years. Oh, I forgot to tell you that my name is Yuri Denisov. I'm head of Moscow Exchange and I moderate our today's session. Recently, we've seen significant amendments to our infrastructure. Right now, we've got the National Depository that has a registry of all investors, the National Clearing Center conducts exchange transactions, and the exchange itself gives a wide range of products. Many of them are traded 17 hours per day, and it has created a convenient, comfortable environment for investors. And the exchange acts as the place for pricing the Russian assets. So we have seen an influx, not just of legal entities, but also individual physical persons. Right now we've got 12.7 thousand physical persons who act as investors. They are actively investing. The Moscow Exchange is a platform for share transactions. We've seen around 15 IPOs and SPOs, and 5 of them were IPOs. Right now there are another 10 transactions for public placement in the pipeline. Let me introduce the speakers to you. We have the major participants of this market joining us today. We've got Elena Ivashentseva, Baron Vostok Capital Partners, Senior Partner. We also have Dmitry Sedov, Co-Head of Goldman Sachs Russia, Vladimir Trakhkov, Vice President for Finance, AFK System, and Alexei Yakovitsky, Global CEO, VTB Capital. Thank you, colleagues. To begin with, I would like to ask you the following question. The IPO volume was not that big recently. In 2020, it was just 0.003% of GDP, whereas back in the past, it rose up to 1.2%, and the ratio of such companies to the GDP is still very small, and there are big prospects for new IPOs. But why so few Russian IPOs so far? And straight to the follow-up question, what do we need to do in order to increase the number of IPOs? Do we need some additional incentives on IPOs? Do we need some specific funds for that? And what do the participants of the market need to do to achieve that? Do we need to explain the onus, the need, the importance of IPO? First, I would like to ask this question of all of our participants. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. First, let me begin by answering your question about the small number of IPOs. First, I would like to say that this number is not that small. We need to provide some context to explain that. You drew a comparison with 2007 because that was a peak, that was the last boom of Russian IPOs, as it were. And that was sort of an end, a wrap-up of a several-year history. Before 2007, there was a previous wave of new companies emerging into the stock exchange, and yes, that was 1.7% of the GDP, and that was the peak figures that we saw back then. And afterwards, there was a period when no one hit the stock exchange. Yes, the number was very small, the windows were shut down, and there were other factors preventing this process. But as a matter of fact, there were not a single company that could do that, because everyone who could have done it had done it in the noughties. Yes, there was potential for that in the 2010s, but not the same volume. Right now, what we're witnessing is another stage of our stock exchange market development. We see a new wave of companies that have emerged over the recent years, that have grown, that have developed over the last decades. These are companies from new sectors, new segments of the economy, and these are new challenges also, and new and traditional sectors and new competitors. So in the last 12 months, we see this surge in the number of IPOs. That is what I think, and I'm confident that this 0.03% of GDP will grow in the next several months and years. Maybe they're going to surpass the figures we saw back in 2007. And as far as capitalization and its relation to the GDP is concerned, I think we will see progress too, because the greater number of companies is going to enter the market, and the share of high-tech companies, IT companies, is going to be greater as compared to the previous wave. As we know, IT companies are more capitalized and they are more evaluated. The valuation is high. So this is but the initial phase of a long wave. There are going to be peaks, there are going to be troughs, downturns, but structurally we are in for a new period of Russian companies that are going to conduct IPOs, that are going to hit the market. So we need to place all of that into the context. And of the last 15 years, we've seen many new deals emerging there in the pipeline, and I think in the several years from now, they will materialize, they will come into practice. To cite a little statistics of the last 12 months, we see 70% what was made of what had been done before in the previous 5 years. Let's have a look at Europe. Yes, the central banks funneled a lot of money into the economy, and 40% of IPO as compared to what happened before in the 5 years before that happened in Europe. So there was a spike in that, and the same is something Russia is in for. There's going to be a spike in the number of IPOs. You mentioned private equity market, and we believe it has to develop, and there are reasons for that, there are grounds. These are not just people who give money for the development of companies, but they also seek to prepare public deals. Private equity investors help companies prepare for that. Elena is one of the biggest players in that field, and they play this role. So the faster the growth of this market, the greater a number of IPOs will get when this new wave that we are witnessing will surge up. And another thing I would like to point out, stimulated investors and traders and issuers by the regulator is a must. I believe that to achieve that, we need some tax-related measures. They would be useful. They could be in the form of tax deductions or tax preferences for IPO funds and for private equity investors. They need to push them towards public placement. And also some measures have to be set forth for those investors that invest into the Russian IPO. We have to have a look at what can be done. This will create a multiplier effect for the Russian economy. This will help both the economy on the whole and individual companies. Yes, thank you. Elena, the floor over to you. Thank you, Yuri. I agree with Alexei to a large extent. This process of a growing number of public companies and the growth of the Russian public market, these processes are natural, and probably it's not that good when it happens too fast, because it might lead, to a pendulum effect. If something happens too fast, the bounce back can be just as quick, just as fast. The thing is, we are working in an economy that has been based on market structures for less than 30 years, and the public market is even younger. In the 90s and in the noughties, the companies were ready for public placement, but those were privatized companies, companies that were in the conventional sectors. Whereas right now we see new companies that were established in the noughties and the 2010s, and they are getting ready to enter the market. So far, just 50% is the ratio to the GDP as compared to 60 to 70% of as compared to the U.S. We shouldn't probably seek the same figures as the U.S., but it is evident that there is a big chunk of our economy, modern companies, technologically developed companies, and these companies are going to grow and they will enter the public market. This is a natural process. And it's good that over the recent years we have seen new impetus, new stimuli emerge for that. We do hope that the system is going to continue to develop. But what do we need for that? First, I would like to underline how important it is that both issuers and both investors understand what it is they're dealing with, because, the public nature of a company is a very specific tool you need to be prepared for. We know examples from history when IPO happen and the placement is successful, but then comes disappointment, either on the part of the owners who got a public company without fully realizing the consequences thereof, nor the expenses, nor the resources they will have to spend inside the money in order to sustain this public status. And very often there is also disappointment on the side of investors, because sometimes, IPO is overestimated, overblown. You buy a beautiful history, and then it turns out that it's no less bright on the inside as it is on the outside. So everyone needs to understand that IPO is but the beginning of a new stage of your public life, and you have to get ready not just for IPO, but for what comes next. Bankers can be of help, but only at the initial stage. After the IPO, the company finds itself on its own with investors, with the market, and that is when the disappointment can happen. So, as private equity holders and owners, as consultants, as investment banks, accompanying companies towards IPO, we need to work together, all of us, to make sure that the companies are successful in the longer term. It does not mean that we simply have to maximize the money that we get from the public market. Investors act as our partners, and preferably they have to remain such for many years, and it is very important that this partnership should be mutually beneficial, because that is what makes that interesting both to investors and to us. Investors will wait for another IPO because they see that they've made money out of the previous ones. Moreover, it becomes a very good instrument to attract more money, to attract funds, and then you can use that money for M&A, and you can also, attract other investors, like private equity investors and others. So, for me, I believe we have to work together. We've got to act collectively to build this market step by step, and we need our companies, our issues, to be ready for a longer-term partnership with investors. Yes, thank you. Dmitry? Oh, no, Vladimir. I'm sorry, Vladimir. Yes, Yuri, if you'll allow me, I would like to add to what Alexei, to what Elena have said. This is more an opinion, a point of view of the economy. When we are contemplating whether to launch an IPO or not do that, the question of how much it's going to cost comes to the fore. And we also have to do a comparison between an IPO and other types of funding, and very often it boils down to multiplying effects. to where you can place your company. Right now, the multiplying effects in Russia are relatively low as compared to other markets, emerging markets, let alone advanced economies. And there are many factors that explain that. Let me dwell on them a little bit. The lower these multiplying effects, the less attractive an IPO is for investors. So why do we have such a small number of IPOs? Not because we don't have good companies, but simply the demand on the part of investors in our market is not sufficient to ensure a high level of multiplication. There is another reason. We have many foreign investors in the market, and so far Russia's share in their portfolio is relatively small as compared to other markets, which constricts the growth. And any successful IPO in Russia usually, accounts for around 50% of money that comes from abroad, from foreign investors. So we need to work with investors. We have to redirect their attention, their efforts towards Russia. And if we manage to secure that, then the multiplying effect is also going to grow and make the IPO more accessible, more simply better, more attractive. Moreover, it's an issue of volume. Yes, the volume of money funneled into the IPOs. It's growing, but we need to contemplate attracting pension money to that. So far, most of that money is constricted within the debt market. In Russia, this segment of the market is very well developed, and the bond market is also very good, as well as the banking credit market. But the money is still constrained within those bounds, and that is due to the regulation and to the requirements set by the lawyers. We have other examples like South African money and other markets. There, the money from pension funds can be channeled into IPOs, and money can move more freely, and their market is developing faster. So we have to think about that in Russia too. There is another factor: retail investors. As we can see, access equity markets leaving behind bonds markets and deposit markets and bonds markets, and they are more active in placing their assets and money in this equity capital. In the past 3 years ago, we had 30,000 retail shareholders. Right now, the figure has increased fivefold, and this trend is going to continue. I would also like to draw your attention to the following fact. We need to focus on developing, on training retail investors. Very often they come into the market without fully understanding that they need to plan for a longer term, they need to diversify their investments. And the education should tell people that they shouldn't wait for quick results. They cannot make money quickly. And unfortunately, this is often the case. People need to understand that they need to plan for a longer term, they need to get experience and expertise. Because, if new investors come into the market and right away they get some bad experience, this might have an impact on their subsequent activities. So probably less risky products should first be offered to new investors, to the new arrivals, whereas more complex instruments have to be reserved for more experienced investors. Especially because young investors, new investors usually have fewer assets, but their share is still growing. We see new private investors coming into the market, and if we help train them, then this will help grow this equity market, which in turn will also increase multiplying effects. On a separate note, I do agree with Alexei decreasing the costs of public placement for issues, which can sometimes amount to several percent. If some of this money can be offset through tax deductions, tax preferences, or some subsidies, this could also be a tipping point in making this decision of whether to launch an IPO or not. And this would push forth the market if there are additional reasons that would nudge companies towards conducting IPOs. And the fourth factor, from the point of view of the market itself, we should probably contemplate creating regulatory possibilities for companies with lower levels of capitalization, with high technology companies, because the requirements are very strict. You have to get net profits for several years, and very often technological companies and companies with low capitalization simply do not meet these requirements. And if we want them to develop, if we want them to be able to attract money, if we want to develop our capital market, then we have to think how exactly we can improve regulation for these companies, for them to be able to launch IPOs. Thank you. In other words, to take stock just briefly, intermediately, of the discussion that we've had so far, we kind of cannot say for sure whether the current number of IPO is big or not, because on the one hand, 15 IPOs after a lull is good. On the other hand, if we cite the figures which we used to have in 2007, then we'll see that the potential is still very big. We have to expand the investors network. We have to think about the correct products. We also need to convince our investors to think for a longer term, because Elena has said we are trying to establish a longer term partnership, and this speculative element has to be brought down to a minimum. The investment potential has to come to the forefront. So developing that kind of cooperation is one of the stimuli, one of the incentives that would attract the right kind of money and expand capital market in Russia. I would also like to highlight that tax preferences and regulatory changes are also of great import in terms of promoting IPOs and raising that number. At the very beginning, both Elena and Alexei have pointed out that if we look at the market, then we will see that we see the arrival of the second wave of IPOs. These businesses were set up a little later, so these are not companies that date back to the Soviet times. No, these are more recent arrivals. And my second question, addressed to Vladimir. Vladimir works at AFP. PK Sistema, and Sistema was working actively with this second wave, and you also put your shares on the stock exchange, and you managed to rear a new cohort of companies that have placed their assets, the shares, in the market. So what is this IPO? Is this public payment? Is it about attracting money for further development, or is it something else? Yes, it is an instrument to attract additional capital. As for what this money is going to be used for, it depends on the strategy of the owner. If IPO seeks to fund investment programs, then you'll see that the number of such IPOs is quite big. Last year, we had two such IPOs. Sigaja hit the market at the Moscow Stock Exchange, and its goal was to fund an ambitious development strategy. The company had elaborated. We didn't monetize our share, nor have we sold our share, because we're confident of the company's development. And another IPO was Ozon, and Elena and we participated as key shareholders in this IPO, and the most important goal was to secure capital for the development of the company, and such IPOs are quite widespread.
выход из компании или частичный выход из компании для того, чтобы реализовывать те инвестиционные проекты, которые у него есть в своей собственной воронке развития. И такие IPO также у нас были. Это, как пример, может привести детский мир, где мы постепенно уменьшили наши доли и сейчас полностью вышли из этого актива. Как правило, здесь собственник выходит не для того, чтобы не для того, что он верит в актив, а может быть даже наоборот верит, а только из-за того, что есть альтернативные инвестиции, в которые ему хотелось бы войти и для которых требуется капитал. Это может быть вторая причина для IPO. Ну и третья, условно, для части собственников может быть это стратегия выхода для того, чтобы диверсифицировать свой портфель, уменьшить свою долю в бизнесе. Это также может быть как обоснованием экономическим обоснованием для выхода из актива. Поэтому все три направления, они, безусловно, используются, и мы как компания также, когда принимаем решение в каждом конкретном случае, смотрим, для чего мы это делаем и почему это нам нужно. То есть здесь не может быть какого-то одного ответа, для чего это делать. Здесь в каждом конкретном случае в соответствии с стратегией компании нужно решать, нужно IPO, не нужно, и для каких целей, и в какой форме его проводить.
Надеюсь, от вашего ответа они помогут собственникам принять решение и выйти по одной из трех этих причин на биржу.
Мне кажется, главное, чтобы собственники понимали, как это работает, все плюсы и минусы. Безусловно, здесь тоже отмечали стоимость этого мероприятия, оно достаточно недешевое, но те преимущества, которые он дает, они точно нужно учитывать. И поэтому обладание полнотой информации собственнику, оно, безусловно, поможет принять правильное решение, идти на IPO или не идти.
Спасибо большое. Вот следующий вопрос я бы хотел адресовать сначала Дмитрию, потом Елене. Вот у нас значительная часть недавних размещений российских компаний была структурирована на уровне зарубежных холдингов. Почему так происходит?
Юрий, спасибо за вопрос. Мы действительно сталкиваемся с тем, что компании, IPO которых находятся у нас в работе, недавние сделки, которые произошли на российском рынке, и те компании, с которыми мы только начинаем диалог и помогаем им в осмыслении как раз того, зачем им выходить на публичный рынок и анализу, готовы они или нет выходить в ближайшее время, мы сталкиваемся с тем, что действительно многие компании, головные компании и потенциальные эмитенты являются не российскими компаниями. Какие причины? Ну, во-первых, надо признать, что есть историческая причина, по которой холдинговые компании образовывались за пределами Российской Федерации. Когда-то были довольно значимые налоговые причины для такого структурирования, сейчас налоговых причин стало значительно меньше. Компании, частью бизнеса которых является наличие и использование интеллектуальной собственности и патентов, предпочитали оперировать в зоне международного права, английского права в частности, и хранить эти нематериальные активы
those non-tangible assets outside of Russia. And there's certain inertia we're witnessing when deciding to go public. There's always an option to reorganize, restructure your business and turn it into a Russian company. But that does not always happen. Another reason, which is not the most important one, does not prevail, but at some point expect that to become obsolete. But currently, under legislation and Russian stock exchange rules, companies are allowed to bring international securities on the market. So, a foreign company is allowed to do placement of the same instrument, shares or depository notes on more than one stock exchange, which is a rather attractive opportunity, a better option than what Russian companies have, because the volume that can be traded on stock exchanges restricted by 25%. So this reason is relevant. As far as I understand, debate is underway on maybe lifting those restrictions, but this is where things stand now. Елена? very much agree with Dmitry. I could think of two reasons. First, when a company decides to do an IPO, most cases they're part of a foreign holding. I would disagree as to why that happens. Not because of taxes, because it's really inefficient for a Russian company to have a foreign holding, because of dividends, because of extra costs involved. So it's not about optimizing tax, but rather about legal remedies, legal protection. When we invest in a foreign company, in a private company, where we enter into shareholders agreement with other participants of the company, well, Russian legislation is still developing. It is moving in the right direction, but the level of protection we get on Cyprus under British law is much higher. And it's time-tested, there's court practice, so we find it much more comfortable. So oftentimes when this company that was established as a private entity in Cyprus, in Holland or elsewhere, when it becomes public, that creates additional difficulties in terms of restructuring. So it's past dependency. The situation will be changing, but it probably will be changing slowly, because dealing with shareholders is a serious matter. And second thing we discussed with regulators, which is also important, and this has to do with how companies work and operate after IPOs, is the question of options for staff members. Under Russian law, in the Russian context, it's much more difficult. We're now preparing one Russian company to go public, and we feel like pioneers in a way, since we set up structures to issue options for our staff members in the future. So it's a relevant problem. It has to do with the fact that legal framework does not go back very long. So it is work in progress. We're talking to a regulator. But it's more complicated now than just setting up a legal entity on Cyprus, do a standard stock option plan, and spare yourself the headache. So we need to be moving forward. But let us not forget that we're trying to find money for Russian businesses. So there are alternatives, but I hope there will be less and less need for those alternatives in the future. I would like to add to corporate governance topic what private companies do prior to the IPO is that legislation of foreign countries, including Cyprus and the Netherlands, allows a lot more flexibility when structuring capital. You can issue different classes of shares, you can make simple and convertible instruments, you can limit voting rights, shares with more voting rights, which is important at different stages of companies' lifetime. Russian legislation is evolving. We're looking forward to future developments. But I think a very important factor was creating a toolkit around privileged shares, which is a neglected instrument for Russian companies, because our privatization experience was not very positive. But we understand that those privileged shares are so much easier to structure now, and you can think of options that meet true interests of investors. So that's a new tool that I hope Russian companies will be using more broadly. Dmitry, I would like to now ask to do a poll. Could you put the question on the screen, please?
Я бы хотел, ну, дайте, может быть, я озвучиваю, на какой биржевой площадке следует делать IPO российским компаниям, исключительно в России, исключительно за рубежом,
both Russian and foreign exchange are possible.
Пока будет идти опрос, я бы хотел по этой теме
And as
поговорить.
we're doing this poll, I would like to talk about it with you. You just mentioned
увеличением количество депозитарных расписок, которые могут обращаться за рубежом.
Growing amount of depository notes that can circulate abroad. It's an important subject that indeed has been discussed. Mr. Shvetsov recently suggested to lift restrictions. But if you look at the amounts of Goldman Sachs, VTB Capital, Nestor Bank, I have a question to Alexei and Dmitry. Let's start by talking about foreign companies that do secondary listing. In Russia, would it make sense to do primary listing now that restrictions have been lifted?
Насколько вот если ты делаешь в России с учетом такого вот размещения и возможности
if you do a placement in Russia,
в большом количестве без ограничений,
if you're allowed to issue unlimited number of notes, does that even make sense to do secondary listing abroad? If Alexei doesn't mind, I'm ready to begin answering this question by saying that placement of securities on the Moscow Stock Exchange, irrespective of the type of the deal, has become a golden standard for placement of Russian companies. Central Bank has done a great job, and so has Stock Exchange. That was very much appreciated by investors. It's become much easier to cooperate with Moscow Stock Exchange, and it has become a golden standard, not because banks, organizers, or issuers decided that, but because investors prefer to invest in companies that are listed on Moscow Stock Exchange. Few investors do not have access to the Moscow Stock Exchange out of those that invest in Russia. An exception would be when a placement is done of stocks of high-tech companies, and this is probably the only sector of the Russian economy where we have been able to invite specialized high-tech investors and global investors as well that hold specialized portfolios.
За пределами этой отрасли в акции российских компаний, а может быть даже в акции компаний региона в целом. Это вот то исключение, которое объясняет, почему некоторые российские компании размещаются на американских биржах.
Russian companies do placement abroad. London Stock Exchange has lost its relevance. It used to be the main platform for placement, and most companies we cooperate with these days are either US or Russian Stock Exchange or Russian Stock Exchange only.
Да, спасибо. Ну, я, наверное, сделаю вывод из того, что сказал Дмитрий. В общем-то, если говорить в целом, никакая другая биржа, кроме российской.
Well, to add, I don't think we need any other stock exchange other than Moscow Stock Exchange, because all infrastructure is in place. Over 70% of all Russian liquidity is accounted for by the Russian Stock Exchange. So the overwhelming majority of all blue chips, Russian blue chips, 80 to 90% of their liquidity they're holding on the Russian Stock Exchange. Indeed, there are certain instruments where foreign liquidity amount is still high, but Russian liquidity approaches 50%, which is a very high indicator. If we try to compare Moscow Stock Exchange to any other platform. And that definitely is not an argument towards keeping other platforms. I mean, half of them are in Moscow and the other half might end up in Moscow. Also, the number of blue chips, the Moscow Stock Exchange itself, Alrosa, Airflood, companies that are only traded in Moscow that have very high liquidity level as compared to the peers that are traded in Europe. Moscow liquidity is much higher than that of many Western platforms. And judging by its market capitalization. From the point of view of high-tech companies, again, I want to give you one recent example. Ozon did it IPO on Nasdaq in Moscow Stock Exchange, and Allegro, which is a Polish company, they did the IPO on the Warsaw Stock Exchange only. So if you look at large holders, shareholders, after the placement, over 70% of shareholders are present in both locations. So the fact that this Polish company is not on Nasdaq, this had no impact whatsoever on demand and on access to key shareholders. And it was a very successful IPO. There's a lot of subscriptions. So one was taking place on the local platform and the other one on Nasdaq. If you look at dozens of transactions in e-commerce over the past 5 years, you'll see that most international companies, not American but international, that operate in this field, over 80% of them did their placements on either domestic or on other international platforms, not on Nasdaq. And in that sense, and colleagues were right to mention that there's certain inertia, there are traditions. Traditions die out hard or evolve hard. But I think we're going in the right direction, and we're likely to very shortly see the companies will do IPOs on Russian Stock Exchange only. And 5 years back, that would be unthinkable. You'd expect such companies to do their IPOs elsewhere. So I think foreign listing is becoming obsolete, a tradition rather than practice. And I think companies need to do placement on Moscow, St. Petersburg Stock Exchange, because this is where the market will be in the next 5 years. Could we see the result of the poll on the screen?
Если еще минуту есть, я хотел бы...
Да, я хотел после этого комментарий ваш получить по этому результату.
And I want to hear your comment. So, what are the... See, it's a tradition. The poll shows that everyone says
параллельно в России и за рубежом, хотя уже ситуация такая, что можно только в России.
Companies should choose both Russian and foreign exchange.
Кстати, отражает реальную картину. Если взять 25 самых ликвидных компаний и посмотреть, то примерно вот 20 имеют только российские.
20% are listed only in Russia, which corresponds to the results of the poll. Well, work that has been done in recent years. I mean, all the investment in infrastructure that helped bring all investors to Moscow, to the Moscow Stock Exchange. I mean, a lot of effort was done over those years. Now it's finished, and if you look at trading share of non-residents, well, it would be 45%.
Есть большая категория, это российские локальные участники, есть большая категория физических лиц, которые работают. Самое интересное, что второй половине дня, если мы посмотрим долю физических лиц, 60%. Когда уже после начинается вечерняя торговая сессия. Ну вот да, вот это интересные показатели. Сегодня тоже говорили об инвесторах.
And we spoke about investors today. My next question goes to all speakers. So please be very brief.
Это вот состояние российского рынка капитала в значительной степени зависит в целом
от situation on the Russian capital market largely depends
хотелось бы понять, согласны ли вы с таким утверждением и как бы вы оценили
how the world sees Russia. how investors see Russia. Would you agree, and
Я согласен, что в любом случае
what do you see happening today? Well, I agree that, of course, attitude towards Russia has an impact,
который получает компании, ту способность, которую можно,
because that defines companies' abilities to attract capital.
в целом отношения
I think,
хорошие, есть куда
all in
стремиться,
all,
есть куда расти.
well, attitude is not bad, although could be improved. But the fact that public placements that our company has been doing and the response of foreign investors shows that there is stable demand,
Ну, безусловно, есть куда
and
стремиться.
Спасибо.
we don't see problems doing placements, although, of course, things could be improved. Judging by our recent transactions, current transactions, we see that foreign investors are very pragmatic. At any point in time, on any market, for any new company, they try to balance risks and potential earnings. Most Russian companies that are entering the market have found good balance. The structure of growth is definitely switching towards Russian institutional investors, but we see investors from the US, Great Britain, continental Europe, and Asia. They're interested, and this interest is getting stronger. Let me rephrase what Dmitry said. Investors are outside politics. They don't want to be political. They're not into geopolitics. Geopolitical situation does influence the market, but I can think of three really big cases: 1998, 2008, 2014. Otherwise, if it's a Russian company that operates domestically, if it's high-tech, for instance, the market is generally very positive. It's a large market that can offer good quality technology. So if it's a healthy growth, if it's a healthy company, investors appreciate Russia. If we don't start talking geopolitics, because otherwise, of course, it gets way more negative. So, hopefully, more and more often our strong businesses will be considered irrespective of where they're based. Let me just give you one example to show how constructive investors are towards Russian companies. We have many companies that are Russian champions or international champions, both in natural resources, high-tech, consumer sectors, that are traded without any discount and compete with companies that have the largest multipliers. And I think it speaks volumes. Good quality Russian companies with good prospects and professional managers, they're appreciated by investors. Thank you. We have more questions from the audience. Next question.
Календамила задает вопрос следующий. Что вы можете посоветовать собственнику бизнеса, который хочет выйти на рынок капитала?
When is a good moment?
Наверное, если очень-очень кратко, должно совпасть несколько важных факторов. Первое. Компания должна быть достаточного размера для того, чтобы иметь возможность предложить инвесторам значимую ликвидность, то есть размер сделки. Первое. Второе. Компания должна иметь политики,
Companies' policies and accounting should be in line with the requirements of both Moscow Stock Exchange and international disclosure requirements. So these are two main factors, I'd say. And third, you need to look at the situation on the market, volatility, macroeconomic situation. Market should be open, investors should be ready to invest. Oh, and I would add that as to figures, the size of IPO matters. Company should cost at least $1 billion, better $2 billion. And second, if you want to attract large foreign investors, the amount of placement should be $500 to $800 million. $800 million is better.
при
to be
более
able to
маленьких
attract larger
размещениях
funds in
объем ликвидности
placement.
становится небольшим.
Otherwise, when placement,
Уже
a
после
small amount of
размещения
liquidity becomes
и
limited after the
больших
placement on stock exchange, and then large foundations will not enter the placement. And that would result in significant discount, which is bad. So to sum up, let me just say two words.
Moscow
Stock Exchange,
Москва, в принципе, готова к тому, чтобы
talked
сделать
about it.
размещение.
Moscow is ready to make a placement, not only in Moscow, but regulatory change of legal framework is needed. Already, we see that 18% of our audience think that placement can be done on the Moscow Stock Exchange only. Very likely we shall see second-tier companies that will make the placement, that have grown their businesses in recent years, that have achieved certain volume, and that would be prepared to do an IPO. So we anticipate about 10 placements, IPOs and SPOs this year, dozens of IPOs in the next years. So hopefully change in legal framework will be instrumental. Unfortunately, we did not have much time. Time flew. Thank you for this interest.